2 years ago, a bunch of my friends and I went on a school-sponsored trip to Alaska, set up by the Pursuit Institute. I was placed in a group with 10 other students and 2 adult chaperones. Another group was also made up of similar numbers, and each group would start at one location, and then we would switch places halfway through. The trip would consist mostly of hiking and backpacking in Denali, where we would camp in tents, and then hiking near the Kenai Peninsula, where we would stay in a cabin. We arrived in Anchorage at about 2 o'clock in the morning, but it was still light out as Alaska never really got dark that time of year. Our groups parted ways after claiming our baggage, and my group began our trip by driving to Denali National Park, where we would be spending the next several days. We all had a great time, and before we knew it, it was time to meet up with the other group and trade places for the second half of our trip. We converged in front of a supermarket, and the 2 groups swapped stories and shared some laughs. It was all fun, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the other group. Their stories would be incredibly vague, or they would just stop halfway through as if they caught themselves from mentioning something without even realizing it. Advertisements. It was all incredibly eerie, but no one but me seemed to notice. When I tried to question them further, or go into detail about their trip, they would simply become dazed and say that it was really all just a blur. Then, getting defensive, they would ask me details about our trip so far. I scoffed and tried to remember a specific event, only to find that I really didn't remember much either. In fact, as I began listening to my group's own stories, we were being just as vague as them. It was all so strange that no one, not even I, immediately noticed that the other group was short 1 kid. Suddenly, though, it hit me. "Where's Josh?" I asked the group. Everyone turned to face me. Their eyes seemed glazed and cloudy as their faces reflected my own confusion right back at me. What they said next made my blood run cold. With such genuine seriousness that it couldn't have possibly been a joke, one by one they asked, "Who the hell is Josh?" Even the adults looked puzzled. Giving a nervous laugh, I turned to my own group for support, only to see that they were looking at me with the same expressions. Confusion was plastered across every one of their faces, looking at me with blank eyes. Then, suddenly, confusion turned to laughter, as if they realized that I had been joking. "Ha ha, nice man. You had me going for a second there," Matt said, as the mood quickly lightened back up. I laughed with them and pretended that it had been a joke, but all I felt was a horrible sickness rising up inside me. Advertisements. That's when a kid from the other group said, "Ha ha, but seriously, what's with your group? You guys are acting all weird and where is Sarah?" "Ha ha, very funny." "Yeah, real original." Members of both groups snapped back at him, almost in unison. No one named Sarah had even been in our group, and even I was pissed that he was making fun of me. That is, until I saw the look on his face. When no one took him seriously, his appearance was bleached to a deathly pale tone, and his eyes widened, shifting from side to side nervously. Then he looked at me. Our eyes met, and we both knew that something was horribly wrong. Although we couldn't really be sure that the other was telling the truth, we both seemingly knew someone who was now forgotten. We simply stood there for what felt like forever, staring at each other. He looked horrified. I'm sure I did too. Before I got a chance to talk to him, however, we were shoved into our separate cars and were on our way to our new destinations. Their group to Denali, ours to the cabin. I doubted talking to him would have done any good anyway, though. What could either of us have said? He didn't remember Josh, and I sure as hell didn't know anyone named Sarah. The more I thought about it, the more I began to convince myself that it must have been a joke by everyone to screw with me. A group joke that everyone was in on except for me. Josh was probably just hiding in the car, laughing his ass off. I felt like such an idiot for believing that another kid had experienced what I had when he was really just flat out mocking me in front of everyone. I buried my face in my hands. Part of me was angry, but I was mostly relieved. It certainly made more sense to think that it was all just a joke on me. I was actually impressed that they'd got the adults in on it too. But overall, I was still pretty pissed, and I decided that the next time I saw the kid who mocked me, I would punch him straight in the face. How dare he mess with me by making up someone? Sarah Duffy, yeah, right. My mind froze. Duffy. He had never said a last name. Where did I get that from? And why did it sound so familiar? What startled me was that I even had a face to put with the name. My mind suddenly exploded with pictures and memories. Sarah! She was my best goddamn friend. How the hell did I forget about her? I was clutching my head and gasping for air as everyone in the car looked at me and began yelling for me to calm the hell down. I couldn't calm down, though. My mind felt like it was being smashed with a sledgehammer, and the more my memory cleared, the worse it got. Pain, the likes of which I had never experienced before, racked my body as I curled into a ball, shivering and straining to maintain consciousness. The memories continued rushing back into my head, threatening to split my mind in two until, suddenly, it was over. I sat up and, bleary-eyed, looked around me. Everyone stared right back at me, terrified. "Guys, Sarah Duffy, please, dear God, tell me you remember her." I practically screamed. Their faces once again switched to anger. "God damn it, John!" one of the adult chaperones yelled. "We thought you were having a seizure or something. If you pull one more stunt like that for the sake of a joke, we'll send you straight home. Are you okay? What the hell was that?" I began tearing up. "You guys don't know Sarah. She was my friend. She was your friend, for Christ's sake." I began searching for a specific memory. "Kevin, you made fun of her goofy hair right when we got off of the plane in Anchorage," I cried. "Please, for the love of God, tell me you remember that." No one said a thing. They all just stared at me with judgmental expressions. "That joke has run its course," Kevin said coldly. Not one of them showed any signs of recognition. But I knew she was real. Or had been anyway. What the hell had happened to her? I strained and tried to remember the last time I had seen her, but any recent memories were still elusive and blurry. No matter how hard I tried, all thinking about it did was bring back the headaches and pain. Finally, I was forced to stop or everyone would begin to seriously worry about me again. I just sat in the car for the next several hours of the drive and stared out the window at the bleak gray surroundings as rain ran down the glass. It had been raining since we arrived in Alaska, and it showed no signs of letting up for the next couple of days at least. Finally, we arrived at the entrance to the trail that would take us to the cabin the other group had stayed at. We unloaded our packs, strapped them on, and set out on our 7-mile hike to where the secluded lakeside cabin lay. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, but since it never really got dark out, our plan was to hike in immediately and get there by 5 o'clock, so as to have a full day ahead of us. That being said, however, the constant rain and low-set clouds made for poor visibility, and the hike in was a struggle to say the least. Through the thick fog, it was near impossible to even make out a tree branch before it struck you in the face, seemingly out of nowhere. Being mindful of possible grizzly bears, we took care to keep our group loud so as to scare them off. About an hour in, we were all singing Journey at the top of our lungs when I suddenly fell to my knees and then collapsed to the muddy ground, clutching my head. I had once again been trying to remember when I had last seen Sarah when it all came flooding back in a horrific wave of grotesque images and unimaginable terrors. There we were, at the Denali campground. The torrential rain pelted down and the sky was so dark that for the first time since we had been there, it actually seemed like night. Everyone was settling down under the tarp around the campfire, and many people were already asleep in their tents. That's when Jenna asked if anyone had seen Sarah, as she still hadn't washed her dishes. "I'm pretty sure she went to bed already," I said. "I don't want to be creepy, but I'll go check to be sure." I reluctantly walked away from the warmth of the fire and into the oppressive darkness and driving cold rain. As I approached her tent, I could tell that she wasn't inside as it was unzipped with the door lying wide open. I immediately ran to close it. What an idiot, I thought to myself. The tent is completely soaked inside now. That's when I heard her muffled, agonizing scream. It came from somewhere in the woods surrounding the campground, and I, without thinking, immediately ran off into the forest after her. After shoving my way through thick spruce and willows, I reached a clearing where I could barely see Sarah's body on the ground as some thing, which was mostly obscured by trees and underbrush, was ripping her open. She was screaming with all of her might, but the thing's bony hooked hand was covering her mouth. Its long fingers curled almost all the way around her head. The sound of her death was horrendous as bones snapped and skin was peeled away. I wanted to help, but couldn't bring myself to move. Sarah was long dead by the time I realized that the creature was beginning to wear her. It had hollowed her out and was now sewing her lifeless corpse onto itself. I was still paralyzed with fear when it suddenly turned towards me. Sarah's grotesque, shredded carcass was now horribly reanimated, and it began crawling towards me like some kind of broken marionette as her dead eyes looked straight ahead, yet saw nothing. I finally broke out of my trance and began frantically sprinting back towards camp. Sarah's corpse could have easily caught me crawling, but the thick underbrush forced it to stand up awkwardly and begin a demented walk in which everything moved all wrong. This, fortunately, gave me enough time to reach the safety of the campfire, although when I arrived, I had no idea what I had been running from, or really any of what I had just done. No one asked me if Sarah had really been asleep, because none of us knew a Sarah. And that thing, pretending to be her, cringing at the light of the fire, slowly slunk back into the dark of the forest. I bolted upright to people yelling, cursing, and struggling to their feet. I had been near the front of the group, so when I fell to the ground, many people behind me tripped over my body and then tripped the people behind them. "Oh God, I'm sorry, you guys," I cried. The ground is really slick here." Advertisements. Grumbles were heard and several insults flew my way, but we all eventually got up and continued moving. My mind was racing. The fact that I could remember Sarah when no one else could must have had something to do with seeing the creature before it stole her skin. For me, it must have just been the initial shock that caused the lapse in memory. It was for this same reason that I could remember Josh while the other kid didn't. My blood froze. He didn't remember Josh because his memory had blocked the horror from him, because he had seen Josh being taken in the exact same area in which we were now hiking, and our bear calls were bringing it right to us. Breathing heavily, I slowly turned my head around to look behind me. Sure enough, following from quite a distance, and just barely visible in the bleak gray fog, I could see the silhouette of some sort of fucked up human impersonation, grotesquely stumbling along just behind our group, wearing the decaying face of Josh. Its limbs swayed and bent in directions impossible for a human to imitate, and there were seams where the skin split away and was held together with nothing but a few fleshy strands. When the creature saw me looking, it darted away off the path, but I could tell that it was still following us. It was waiting for something. I doubted it would attack us with such a large group, and I was sure that no one would believe me, and so I was forced to simply continue hiking. Finally, we reached the cabin and everyone tried to get some last-minute sleep before we started our day. Everyone but me. I knew that thing was sulking around in the darkness of the woods surrounding the cabin, waiting for one of us to go out alone. Morning came and everyone quickly prepared for our hike of the day. We would be hiking up a mountain, which required some intense bushwhacking just to reach the base, thus realistically making the trip at least 4 hours both ways. We packed our lunches, consisting of nothing but protein bars and water, and zipped up our rain gear as the weather was still nothing short of a downpour. The sky remained a depressing gray, and light thunder could be heard rumbling in the distance. That's when someone said what I had been dreading. The worst-case scenario. Ashley stepped forward and apologetically said, "Sorry everyone, but I feel just terrible. I think I'll stay behind on this one. You guys go on ahead. I'll stay here at the cabin." "No!" I cried. "You have to come with us. We have to stay together." Everyone turned and looked at me. "Jesus, John, if she's not feeling well, let her stay," Pam scolded. "Ah," I stammered. "That's not it. I just, fine. I'll stay too." "You don't have to do that, John," Ashley said. "I'll be fine here alone." "No, you won't," I wanted to scream, but I had to calm my nerves. Nah, I didn't want to go on this dumb hike anyway. I laughed. You guys have fun, though. Everyone looked at me weirdly and then glanced at each other before shrugging and heading off into the woods. I wasn't sure if we would be any safer with just the two of us, but what else could I have done? We would just have to buckle down inside the cabin and hope for the best. As soon as the others disappeared out of sight, I turned to Ashley and said, "All right, we need to get inside the cabin now. I appreciate you staying with me and all, but you're kind of freaking me out," she said. "Haha, sorry," I awkwardly laughed. "It's pretty damn wet out here, though. We should really go inside." "Yeah, that's a good plan," she said slowly. "I better lay down for a bit." That's when I saw him, or it, standing 20 or so feet behind Ashley. Josh's decaying corpse, horribly stretched and disfigured in order to cover whatever thing was wearing it. Ashley saw me looking and turned around to let out a strangled squeak. What the fuck is that?" she screamed. I said nothing and simply grabbed her arm, taking off running to the cabin, slamming the door behind us. The thing didn't run after us. Rather, it began slowly walking towards the cabin. It knew we had nowhere to go. I locked the door and scrambled to barricade it with anything I could find. Advertisements. Now there was nothing to do but watch its demented impression of a person as it crawled ever so slowly towards the door. Its hands dragged along the muddy ground and its fleshy skin hide swayed ever so softly as it staggered. "What the hell is that?" Ashley kept repeating over and over between her ragged breaths. I don't know," I stammered. "I just don't know." "What does it want?" she screamed as it reached the door and tried the handle. "I assume it wants a new coat," I said through clenched teeth. She drew a breath and fell to the ground before looking up at me, horrified. The thing moved away from the door and now stood a few inches behind one of the windows, staring in at us. Its cold gaze could be felt from behind the dead eyes of Josh's face, and we could hear skin widening as it smiled. It was messing with us. Ashley broke down and began weeping. "Leave us alone," she cried. "Get the hell away." The thing did nothing and simply stood there motionless. Then it slowly lifted up one of its hands and began lightly rapping on the window. Knock, knock, knock. A slow, steady rhythm. It had no intention of breaking the window or anything. It just wanted to let us know that it was there. Not that we needed the reminder. I couldn't take my eyes off it. This continued for several hours as the sunlight slowly faded and the rain and wind picked up. Soon the sound of it knocking was almost drowned out, and I was having to strain to see it in the dim light. Heavy sheets of water whipped around and obscured its form. At one point, I let my eyes wander for too long, and when I looked back, it was gone. The knocking had stopped. I bolted upright just in time to barely catch a glimpse of it disappearing around the side of the cabin. "This is bad," I said. "I think it's tired of waiting." Ashley let out a squeal and buried her face in her hands. I wasn't sure if it could get in from somewhere else, but it clearly knew something we didn't. "It's okay," I said, thinking fast, trying to pep talk myself more than anything. "All we need to do is wait for the others to get back. They should be here any minute now." "Who?" Ashley asked. "The rest of our group," I said. "Kevin, Lauren, Pam, those guys, remember?" I don't know who you're talking about," she stated, looking at me puzzled. "It's always been just the two of us." My heart practically stopped, and as I sank to the ground in despair, I began to hear knocks, all around the cabin. Before I get into this, I want to be clear. I'm not insane. I don't take meds for anything, and I sure as hell don't do any drugs. I'm as sober as they come, mostly by choice, but my folks drilled into me that a clean body is what's best if you want to live well. I say this because every time I tell someone about what I'm about to tell you, they say I smoked too much of something or I need to be checked by some darn specialist. I know damn well I'm fine, and I regret ever telling anyone who just wants to brush off what I have to say. Not that I don't blame them. Hell, I wouldn't believe it. But ignoring it only makes it worse. I wish it were just a bad pill or brain defect. But it ain't. It happened only a couple months ago. Me and my buddy, we'll call him Red, always headed out into the woods to get away from our obligations back in the city. Nothing beat the smell of the pines and a good old day of fishing while you kick back as the sparrows chirp in the distance. I tell you, it was like healing the soul every time Red and I went out there. I just wish it stayed that way. You see, this thing never happened before. Not once in all my years of going out into the woods and sleeping under the stars did I ever feel unsafe or worried something might go wrong. Red always brought bear spray and a good amount of supplies in case anything didn't go our way. I slept as sound as a bug in a rug, knowing whatever came our way, me and Red could take it on. But after that night, no amount of bear spray or bullets will ever let me sleep that soundly again. It was the last day of our weekend trip. Red had already packed up his tent and was getting the fire going before dark set in. He always slept in his truck on the last night, said it made the next morning easier for him. He hated having to get up and start packing. I was chopping wood for the fire with our old axe we brought with us on every trip. We had chopped down an old pine early that day, and I was cutting them into smaller sections so we could get a nice warm fire going. Just before the sunset, we had our fire roaring like you wouldn't believe. Red even called it the perfect campfire, and I had to agree. We stacked the wood like a Jenga tower, so the flames could crawl inside the holes and breathe without losing too much heat. We admired our handiwork, while Red cracked a beer, and I sipped on a cool batch of iced tea I brewed yesterday. We sat there in the dark, with the glow of the fire, chatting about work, movies we hadn't seen, and our own observations on life. But if you've ever sat around a fire, you know for the most part, you're not looking at the people with you. No, you're watching the fire. Watching its flames lick the side of the wood, seeing it dance around as it makes its way into the air. You feel it drawing you in, its warmth, its light. It's so easy to get lost in it. Makes you want to touch it, but you know it'll burn, so you compose yourself to just stare at it. Sometimes it feels like you're losing track of time, and you gotta ask yourself, when was the last time I said something? I had that thought when Red and I were sitting around the fire, so I snapped myself back and asked Red when he wanted to wake up tomorrow. That's when I noticed Red was standing. He was holding his beer at his side. The white suds from his drink were beginning to pour out onto the dirt, and his eyes were locked on the flames. I didn't think anything of it at first, figured he was stretching his legs. I made some dumb joke about watering the ground with beer ain't good for the trees, but he didn't respond. He just kept staring at the fire like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. Thinking he was just tired of my crap, I let him be and tossed another log into the flames. It was then Red seemed to shake his fog and come back. He noticed his beer was suddenly empty and crushed the can before venturing over to his truck to grab another. I remember asking him if I pissed him off, but when he returned, he told me he didn't even hear my joke, said he didn't even remember getting up. We both agreed no more logs for the rest of the night, and sleep was a good idea. So after cracking another beer, Red and I sat once again around the fire waiting for the remaining wood to burn. I wish we had just gone to bed. Once again, I found myself watching the fire in silence, staring at the red and yellow light as it swirled and flickered in the darkness. After a while, I swore I started to see shapes or pictures begin to form in the flames, like animated images manifesting within the heat of the fire. I watched as faces began to form and disappear, almost like magic was being performed. I knew it was most likely my brain trying to find patterns in the light, so I let my mind wander as I watched the burning flames continue, but I stopped thinking that way when I swore I heard someone speak. It was a low, rumbling voice mixed with the hissing of the pine wood. It sounded like low thunder and sharp, abrupt words that cut deep into my mind. It asked me if I was cold, if I was lonely, if I was hungry, all at once, like a chorus of rolling voices overlapping each other. I couldn't believe what I was experiencing. I felt so warm, embraced by the fire like a fresh blanket. The flames seemed so inviting, like it had answers to questions I didn't know I had. I wanted to taste the fire, hold the fire, be in the fire. I needed to be a part of the flame. I could see hands gesturing me closer towards the embers, pulling me into its glow, its beautiful, welcoming glow. The fire was all around me now as I stood up from my seat. It swirled like a raging tornado, but its heat did not cause me pain. I knew with my very being to trust this flame with all I had within me, to let it take me. I would be safe no matter what happened. I saw beauty manifest itself in the embers as they drew me closer and closer. The smell of the smoke was intoxicating. I wished I would never breathe air again. I wished I'd never feel anything other than this flaring heat. I stepped closer with each heightened sensation that passed over me. I never wanted anything more than to be in the fire. The idea of my flesh melting away brought me joy. To become ash and join the fire became a fate I accepted with eager breath. I stood now before the fire. Its flames rose into the air like a pyre that reached the sky, turning the cosmos red. It burned the stars and ignited the trees, leaving the branches black and charcoal. Nothing could extinguish its light. Nothing will ever stop it. All that was left was to join the burning euphoria and submit myself to its divinity and cleanse myself of this physical form. The voice was a booming orchestra of revelation and jubilee echoing through the sky. It called out with prophetic blessing, promising me a life of ease and without woe. I believed its words, and I reached out to grasp at its flaming tendrils, enveloping my hands with warmth and welcoming touch. For the first time in my life, I knew my purpose. It was to be here. It was to hear these words. It was to burn. The flames would be my guide and take me into its arms. I felt loved. I felt cherished, and then I felt a strike hit me across the face. I hit the ground hard and rubbed my cheek, which felt hot from the impact. I looked around after collecting myself to see Red was standing over me, breathing heavily, like he just got done lifting weights. I scanned our campsite and saw nothing out of the ordinary. No blazing trees, no red sky filled with fire, just a campfire barely lit, and two fools who looked like they just got done fighting each other. It was then I noticed the pain in my hand. I looked down to see my right hand had been severely burned and was not looking so good. I asked Red just what the hell was he thinking, punching me in the face. He lifted me to my feet and told me what just happened while he bandaged me up. Apparently, if he hadn't done anything, I'd be a dead man. Red had snapped out of some kind of trance when he dropped his beer on his foot and then noticed I was standing over the fire. No matter what he did, he couldn't pull me away from it. Said I looked possessed and wasn't answering him when he called out. He punched me when I started putting my hand into the fire and wouldn't pull back. Said he tried to wrestle me away, but I was locked in like some kind of statue. The moment he started to hear my skin sizzle, a quick right hook to the jaw was all he could think to do. As he told me this, I couldn't help but think about what I had just seen. The images were as clear as daylight in my mind. After he finished wrapping my hand, I told him what I saw, to which he simply answered, "I wanted to burn too." We didn't talk about the fire after that. In silence, we put out the fire, grabbed our stuff, and drove into town to get me some medical attention. That was the last time Red and I ever went out into the woods, and the last time I ever went near an open flame. Thankfully, the hand is healing up okay, but it's a grim reminder of that night, and every time I catch myself looking at it, that low rumbling voice echoes in my mind. Believe me or not, that's up to you. But if you're ever near a flame and it starts to feel inviting, crack open a beer. It might just save your life. As I sit here now beside my pond and watch the autumn fog dance along the water, and as the leaves whisper and chatter to one another as the wind lets them, I think of my wife and how sorry I am I can't live the rest of my days here like she wanted. On our little 12-acre farm, our little quiet heaven, or at least that's what it was supposed to be. But the land holds secrets. I know now, without a lingering question in my heart, that hell exists. I wish that gave me comfort, because that means that Diana is waiting for me at our next quiet little heaven, one that doesn't mock the search for peace. But it doesn't. Once the sun winks its red eye closed and retires for the evening, I'll be gone from this place. But there are two things I need to do first, and one of them is to write this down before I put it behind me forever. Although, a part deep inside of me, the part that can't be lied to, knows that the curtain will never close on me again, no matter where I go. Knows that I'm forever and always awake. Cancer took her last year. She was 37. There are a million words in me I could say about losing her. The shock, the denial, the hope lost, and the twinkle in her eyes that was lost with it. The pain. Those nonsense last words, the last breath. She's gone now. That's all that matters. We'd bought a 12-acre homestead in southern Illinois to escape the city. The house had been built in 1898 as a colonial revival home and was more or less falling apart, but there was this secluded rural charm about it. It sat on a strip of land several miles off of any main road, with fields used for harvesting corn nestling the house on either side, and behind it was a fenced-in pasture that shot back into the woods, which was perfect for our 2 horses. When we did the tour, we sat on the porch and looked out at what might have been the most peaceful view we'd ever seen, with fields of wheat yawning and bowing in the wind like a sea of gold across from us. I could see in her eyes that she was in love, and so we made our minds up to make an offer right then and there. During the final walkthrough, the sellers had forgotten they'd changed the locks. They were going through what was apparently a rough divorce, and our agent had to call the estranged wife in to give us access to the home. She was amiable enough when she arrived and gave us a handful of apologies for not remembering to provide a new set of keys, but what struck me as odd, even then, was that she had seemed reluctant to step onto the property at all. She parked her car on the gravel road about 100 feet in front of the house and talked to us from there. And when she wasn't sure which key it was on her keychain to hand to us, she looked disquieted. She walked briskly to the house and fumbled with her keys and the deadbolt until she finally found the right one and opened the door without walking in, pulling her hand away from the doorknob like it was something hot to the touch. She said something about needing to get some fresh air, told the agent to bring her keys after locking up, and then hurried back to her car. I thought there may have just been bad memories of the marriage that she didn't want to revisit, or that she maybe felt awkward, or that she was intruding. It all makes sense now. We knew we had our work cut out for us from the beginning, and when we settled in, it was one thing after another. Leaking toilets, bad insulation, water damage. But we were happy. Diana got sick not long after, but I'm truly grateful for that short period of time when we would work on our old farmhouse, drink coffee and watch the sunrise from our front porch, taking in all of the life around us. After she passed, her sister took her horses as agreed, as well as our 2 dogs temporarily. It wasn't my original plan, but I was taking everything pretty hard and just needed to be alone for a while. Just needed some quiet, which I didn't get anyway because of the damned wind, with its constant howling and moaning through the windows. My drinking was bad. There are large gaps in my memory, especially right after. I drank from the bottle like the evening's watery haze would drink me in return, hoping it would dissolve me into nothing. One morning, I'd woken up to a massive hangover that felt like it couldn't be cured by anything other than the sun and a walk. So I threw on some coveralls and went on into the woods behind the property. I'd known there was a stream, or a creek of some kind that ran east through it, but the thorns and brush were so overgrown I couldn't see through more than 10 or so feet. There was a supposed path of some kind that led to the stream, and I thought if I could just push my way through enough, I'd eventually run into it. It only took me about 5 minutes until an overgrown but manageable clearing revealed itself and led me to the small stream, a steady flow of water running through it. It was only about 6 or so inches deep, but had carved its own winding path deep into the dirt over the years. I followed, thinking I'd see the tracks of various animals nearby that came to drink from it, and I did. I continued on, and in the water, I started seeing these broken fragments of bottles. They were old, very old, softened and smoothed by water and sediment and time. They were the kind of bottles you'd see on a movie set in some 19th century period piece film, with deep brown and emerald glass, with all of those gaudy oblong angles, like some sort of snake oil elixir. There were just a few scattered fragments at first, but the further I trudged on, the more abundant the shards became until I came to the stream's watershed, and just beyond that was an opening in the ground that looked like some sort of den, big enough to walk in if I crouched. There must have been a dozen or so broken bottles in front of it. It was like someone had dumped them in a hurry all at once, or had drunk them in unison, and then smashed them for some reason. Jutting out of the sand in the water, was a green bottle that seemed like it had remained intact over the years. It had 2 circular finger handles on either side of its neck and some kind of impressed label in the glass. But the letters were immersed, and I couldn't make them out. I pulled it free and rinsed it in the water, and I was just able to make out the smoothed letters stamped into the glass. Arsenic. Bottles of poison. But why? Why here? And how had this been here all these years without being found or picked up by hunters or one of the previous owners? I reached into my pocket to take a picture of the whole scene with my phone, but realized I had forgotten it. The hole bellowed at me as if commanding me to gaze into its swallowing darkness. And although I couldn't see anything, I felt I was being watched from within it. A coldness crawled up my spine. I shoved the bottle into the big front pocket of my coveralls and made my way back, not being able to help but check behind me several times along the way. When I got back to the house, I poured myself a neat glass of whiskey. It was still early in the afternoon, but hunting for little treasures on the land was something Diana had loved to do, and so the thought of coming across such a strange find made the antique arsenic bottle quite heavy in my pocket. I thought I'd lighten it with bourbon. I placed the old green bottle on my coffee table and sat across from it on my couch, and I sipped my drink. I stared at it in my quiet, empty house, quiet save for the wind. I sipped again. It was so interesting. I thought deeply on how it got there, how it hadn't been found in, well, I don't know, 130 years, maybe more. I knew arsenic had been used in tonics and pesticides before they knew how deadly it was, but it just seemed such a strange place for them to be. I thought maybe the isolation and grief had made me paranoid. I sipped my drink again. I poured another glass, and then a few more. The room went orange as the low sun came through the glass, and the wind howled through the poorly sealed windows. The old poison bottle had entranced me, and in staring at it I'd lost track of time. Things went soft around the edges, and the whiskey numbed my tongue, glass after glass. But I remember at some point I'd imagined it had comforted me, spoken to me with silent words. Drink it, it said. Drink it in, and I did. It knew my pain and wanted it gone. I sunk into the bottle and faded with the evening. I awoke on the couch with a massive hangover, the bottle still staring. An empty one that had housed the whiskey the night before now rested beside it. I fumbled around in the medicine cabinet for some spare aspirin and forced them down with some water from the sink, and went to the front porch to sit in my favorite chair and catch some crisp morning air. When I stepped outside, I noticed that the chair had been turned around, toward the windows, facing right into my living room where I had slept the night before. It had been pulled close to the glass, almost like whoever was sitting in it wanted to be as close as possible to get a better view of the inside. It had to have been me, I'd thought. But why the hell would I do that? The wind had been howling and was known to blow things around, sometimes clear into the yard, but this chair was made out of cured oak and weighed 30, maybe 40 pounds. It didn't seem likely to have moved it. This heavy, floral smell clung to the wood, like some sort of gaudy lavender perfume you'd find buried in some box in your grandmother's basement. Not thinking of the absurdity of it, I went back inside and sniffed the mouth of the old bottle. Nothing but the remnant smell of water. The pain from the hangover pulled the turned chair to the back of my mind. I had been in a drunken stupor and could have fumbled around out there doing God knows what. I only managed to make it a few hours before heading to the liquor store to grab another bottle. I sat back on my couch, across from the old green bottle and its drained companion from the night before, and I drank in silence, just like it wanted me to. Sometime during the night, maybe 11 or so, but it's hard to say. I was very drunk. I was browsing my phone from my couch, and 3 soft knocks tapped at my door. I didn't see any car lights come down the gravel road that ran adjacent to my house. Maybe one of the neighbors needed something, I thought. For reasons I can't quite comprehend, I offered a consulting glance at the bottle on the table. It told me to answer in its wordless way, and I listened. I got up and went for the door, flipping the light switch to the porch on and remembering there had been a short in the wires from mice or something. I opened it. There stood a thin young woman, faintly bathed in what little light the only lamp in the living offered. It was hard to make out her features, but she looked like she might have been in her early to mid-20s. Her hair was long and looked like it could have been a light brown, draping halfway down her back. She wore this white embroidered nightgown that might have been beautiful, except even in the timid light I could see dirt on it in several places. The shadows hid much of her face, but even then she looked pallid, her eyes bringing about this astounded look on her face as if she were confused or lost. I stood there with my drink in my hand, unsure of what to say, or how to address such a strange and unexpected visitation in the middle of the night. She said that she was sorry for disturbing me, but that she was looking for her dog. She said she lived about a mile down the road and had been hearing prairie wolves the past few nights, and her dog had run off into the woods and was nowhere to be found. She said she was getting very worried they might have tricked him into chasing after them. I told her I hadn't seen or heard of any coyotes, and then asked her about the dog. She said he was a collie and his name was Copper. I looked down and noticed she didn't have any shoes on, and her feet were covered in mud. "Did you go running through the woods in a gown without shoes on to look for him?" I asked her. She glanced down and studied her muddied feet with that same surprised look and said nothing. I thought maybe she was drunk or medicated, but she looked harmless, and the whiskey had always made me well disposed. I told her to wait a moment, and I'd go get a towel so she could wipe her feet off and could come inside and warm up for a moment. Then, we'd take a spotlight to go looking for him. As I reached to close the door handle and grab a towel, I noticed her eyes, so dazed and cloudy and confused before, now sprung alive in the dark with a distilled intensity, focusing in on the green arsenic bottle that sat on my coffee table. She took a single, eager step toward it, stopping just before my doorway. I held my hand out to halt her, a little startled by the approach but still attempting to be polite. She gave a sheepish grin and shook her head. "I'm deeply sorry. The cold has made me too eager for warmth this evening," she said. It was so fast I could have easily missed it, but as she smiled, I noticed the inside of her upper lip stuck to her teeth, lagging on one side before breaking free as if her mouth had been exceptionally dry. The flesh of her lips looked harder than usual, stiffer, thin slivers of her dark gums revealing themselves. The whiskey had dulled my senses, but when she stepped in closer, I also noticed a lavender perfume smell on her and thought of the chair outside. She could have just been dehydrated for all I knew, but the whole thing just felt off, felt wrong. I closed the door and caught her glance at the bottle with that same look again, unable to will her eyes from peering at it. I stood there for a moment, hand still on the doorknob, and then flicked the deadbolt locked with careful fingers. I thought about calling the police at that instant. It was weird, sure, but I'd ran out after our dogs half-dressed, with no shoes on before when they chased deer or a passing car or something, so it wasn't unthinkable. But that smell, there was no mistaking it. Behind me, I could feel the bottle was displeased. Let her in. I shook my head at it and then downed the rest of my drink. "No." "Pardon?" I could hear her say from the other side of the door. "Actually, I'm very sorry, but it's late. I can call someone for you if you like. I'll keep an eye out for Copper and we'll take him to your house if he turns up." "Which house did you say it was down the road again?" There was a pause that felt like an eternity. "Oh," she said finally, not answering my question. "That's a shame." She sounded disappointed. Not angry or insulted, just let down. I opened my mouth to apologize again, but the words never managed to crawl out of it. The lamp's dim light didn't reach far enough to illuminate the porch through the windows, but in the darkness, I thought I could see the silhouette of a head tilt its way into view from the side of the windows the front door had been butted up against. The soft creaks of graceful bare feet on wooden steps groaned as she left the porch, and she walked into the night without saying another word. I grabbed my 9mm and made my way around the other doors to double-check the locks. My mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. "Prairie wolves," I said to myself as I poured more bourbon into my glass. Who calls them that these days? A part of me felt guilty. Maybe I just sent a poor girl with a missing dog back into the cold, but her mouth, that perfumed smell on her that saturated my chair the night before, how she looked at the green bottle on my table. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't think she could pose any real physical threat to me, but I felt uneasy, unalone. I took another drink from the glass. I pulled my phone out to call the police, trying my best to stay out of the line of sight of the front windows. Although I'd heard her walk off moments earlier, I couldn't help but feel naked through the glass. I got ready to dial the local station's number, but the old green bottle beckoned me over to it. "Drink it," it said, and I did. I thumbed my phone back into my pocket and sunk back into the couch and drank myself into an empty void. 3 empty bottles greeted me from the table in the morning, the newest member laying on its side. I was on the floor. Even with the throbbing headache, I thought of the strange woman and how I managed to get drunk instead of calling the police. I looked around. The house was trashed. I hadn't cleaned it in weeks. Hadn't even swept up the clumps of dog hair that accumulated in the corners of the rooms and under the furniture from months before. And now my drinking had gotten so bad, I couldn't even manage to call the police before blacking out. Diana would have been heartbroken if she'd seen this. She hated my drinking. I let shame hit me like a puff of heavy smoke, and then I called the sheriff. As I dialed, I could still feel that green arsenic bottle pulling my gaze toward it, weighing the room down from that coffee table and anchoring everything in place, drawing me in like a dancing fire in the dark. The sheriff came by not long after, and I told her what had happened the night before. That a strange young woman was knocking on my door in the middle of the night, but hadn't actually done anything illegal that I could be sure of, but that she might have been trespassing on my property the previous night, and might have been on drugs. I told the sheriff where the woman said she came from, and asked her if she knew any of the homes along the road the woman had described to me. She said there was only one within a few miles on that particular stretch, but the house had been condemned 20 or so years. She said drugs had gotten pretty bad in the neighboring town, and it was possible the problem had made its way to the more rural parts of the area. She told me she would ask around in the area to see if any of the other homes experienced anything similar, and then offered to check in throughout the night. I told her it wasn't necessary, and that I had plenty of guns in the house to protect myself with if it came to that. After the sheriff left, I uncorked my bottle and poured a glass. I just needed to take the edge off. When I looked over at the coffee table, I noticed the antique bottle was gone. Panicked, I searched the house for it for 15 or so minutes before I realized I'd put it in my coat pocket before the sheriff came by earlier, just to keep it close. A few hours later, as the sun was going down, I went around back near the gated strip that led to our pond and pasture that was butted up against the woods, where Diana's horses used to be. There had been some equipment I'd left out there for weeks, and there was supposed to be a storm coming that evening, and so I'd wanted to move everything into the barn. When I got back to the gate, I noticed it had been opened, which was something I never did, even with the horses gone. In the fading light, I made out footprints along a thin beaten path that ran through the center of the strip where the horses used to walk up to get feed. Bare footprints from small bare feet. She had walked through the woods, through the pasture to come knocking on my door. I thought I could make out at least 2 sets going both toward the house and then back down the path again. But with overcast blocking the moon and stars, it was getting hard to see anything. I followed the footprints 200 or so yards until I could see them cut down into the pasture and to the gate that led into the woods. It had also been left open. I reached for the old green bottle for comfort and realized I'd left it in the house. I needed my gun. I needed my gun, and I needed to call the sheriff, and I needed that goddamn bottle. I began making my way back to the house when I saw the woman, walking past the pond and the mausoleum where Diana rested and heading toward the house. She would have been impossible to make out in the dark if it weren't for that white gown. I yelled out to her and started running before tripping over some broken wire fencing that was on the ground. She either ignored me or couldn't hear my voice through the rustling corn, which had begun to move with the wind from the oncoming storm. I was just too far away from her. She made her way to the house with this calm grace, and then went around it to the front. I realized my gun had been on my table, in plain sight, and I hadn't locked my door. I'd been drinking until I was numb, just like that fucking bottle had told me to, made myself careless and stupid. There were hammers and a machete in the barn, but it was in the opposite direction, and by the time I grabbed one of them, she could easily have been inside the house for a minute, maybe more. The best thing I could find on the way was a little trench shovel in the garden. I grabbed it. When I got around to the front of the house, the door had been cracked half open. She'd gone inside. The wind blew harder and began its howling, now carrying cold pellets of rain that stung as they hit my face. My legs didn't want to approach the house, but slowly I did. That middle step to the porch creaking the loudest it ever had, even in the wind and the rain. I pushed the door open further with the tip of the shovel. The whiskey bottles that had made themselves so comfortable next to the old green poison bottle were scattered about the floor, the green bottle gone. The gun was still sitting there, untouched. I grabbed it. I looked around for my phone but didn't see it in sight. I could hear her walking around upstairs in what sounded like Diana's office. I aimed my gun into the darkness toward the top of the stairs and yelled out to her, "Come out of there! I'll fucking shoot you if I have to." The creaking floorboard stopped for a moment, and then she walked out onto the landing, an obscure phantom in the dark, except for the faint lunar glow of her gown, except for the whites in her confounded eyes. She had the bottle in her hands, and she seemed to be crying. Her hands were shaking. "Don't drop it," I said lowly, eagerly. She tilted the bottle up above her head and stuck her tongue in the opening of its neck, desperate for something that hadn't been inside of it for well over a century. Her tongue made this squelching noise as she did it, as if it were much, much too dry. She gave me a distraught look and cried harder. The wind moaned through the windows, through the darkness of the house. I'd never felt more alone in my life. "Why isn't it working, Elijah?" she asked me from the top of the stairs. I didn't know what to say, nor did I have any clue who Elijah was. The woman had clearly lost her mind. I had to make sure she put the bottle down before she broke it. "Come on down, we'll just talk about it." She cradled the bottle tighter, taking slow steps down the staircase and stopping at its base. "It didn't work for me," she said in the dark, sobbing as the words left her. I lowered my gun and reached for the lamp on the island in the kitchen near the foot of the stairs, and for the first time, I truly saw her. She wasn't much more than an emaciated skeleton. Her skin was hardened and yellowed and pulled tight to her. She looked not much different than Diana did on her hospice bed just before the end. No doubt, if I would have left her in her bed a few days after she'd passed away, they would have been hard to tell apart. I should have been terrified, and a part of me was, but she looked so helpless, so pitiful, like a child holding a teddy bear. This overwhelming sensation of sadness filled me. "Why did it work for you and not me, Elijah?" she asked me again. I set my gun on the table. I thought for a moment about whether or not to correct her on who I was, and decided it didn't feel like it was the right thing to do. I asked her what she meant. Her eyes sobered like she realized I wasn't whoever this person was for a moment, and then she retreated. "It calls to me, but why am I still here and you're not?" I didn't respond, but I felt her words. I'd felt them in me every day since Diana had gone. "And the others?" she asked. I began crying with her. "I'm so sorry." At this, she regarded me, then winced with a tender pain and looked away. She tried drinking from the bottle again in vain. I reached out and touched her arm gently to stop her. Her skin was cold and hard. She sobered her gaze once more, and for a moment the faintest smile rose on her face, and then she retreated again for the last time, into whatever life she had known when she was still alive. I guided her gently to the door, her bottle still cradled close to her, and stood in the doorway as she left. I wanted to hold on to it more than anything, but it didn't belong to me. I asked her, "Was there ever even a copper at all?" "Have you seen him?" she asked. I shook my head. She turned and moved around the house. I walked into the yard and to the side and watched her go on, back through the pasture and into the woods, the rain and the wind blowing her hair and gown like wild rags. She never looked back once, and then she was gone. The next few days I did a deep dive into county records, trying to find anyone that ever owned a home in the area named Elijah, but nothing turned up. It was as if she and whoever Elijah was never existed at all. I don't know exactly what happened to her, but I feel like she was warning me in the only way she was capable, to avoid whatever hell she had found herself in. Every day I fight the urge to go back into those woods and see if that bottle is back where I found it. I catch myself walking towards the trees that lead to the stream, to that hole, and inevitably, to that bottle. But I don't dare go in. She'd no doubt come looking to reclaim it, like she's likely done many times before. And if she didn't, I don't think I'll be strong enough to part with it again, which is why I'm writing this. I said that I have 2 things to do before I leave, and writing this down had to come first, so you might understand when the realtor tells you why there's an abandoned mausoleum near the pond in the back pasture. I can't let Diana stay here. I'm taking her with me and reburying her closer to our hometown, near the place we first met. Someday, I'll revisit that place in the woods and see if I can do something, anything for the woman, but I'm not strong enough to face it. Not yet. Even now, I can feel the pull of that bottle out in the stream, begging me to come back and take it. And even as I write this, I can feel I'm being watched from the tree line, and I'm getting this feeling that it isn't her this time. I was homeless for a few years from 18, 21, and I used to stay in a tent with my ex. I always had to end up moving my tent spot eventually because the cops would find us. Either way, I had spent a lot of the time in the woods at night. One night when walking back to my tent, I heard something down the trail a bit. I shined my light in the direction of the sound to be met with glowing eyes reflecting my flashlight. However, where the eyes were made it so, whatever I was looking at was taller than me, and I'm 5'8". There is no animal that tall in my area. I turned to my ex and tell him to start going to the tent faster. He could tell something was off, so he asked if I was all right. I told him I'll tell him when we get to the tent because I have always been told not to acknowledge such creatures' spirits as it gives them more power. Then some nights there would be smacking on our tent. It would hit all the sides of the tent. We would look out the tent windows and check outside the tent, but we would never find anything or hear any footsteps. Another night, during the summer, we had decided to go for a small hike at night because it was way more of a tolerable temperature. About 15 minutes into the hike, I had started feeling paranoid, like I was being watched. About 5 minutes later, I heard a maniacal laugh coming from somewhere in the woods. I couldn't pinpoint which direction though. My ex asked what was that, and I loudly said, "I don't know, but whatever the fuck it is needs to stop." As soon as I said this, multiple maniacal laughs now started. My ex and I turned around, walked back for what felt like the longest 20 minutes. Another time I found a severed coyote head with something hung in the tree beside it that had a tooth in it. And lastly, one time I was with my friend parked on the road far into the woods so we could smoke. The passenger window was down, which is where I was sitting. The woods were right next to me. Again, the feeling of being watched overwhelmed me. 2 minutes or so later, I hear a hello, and then John coming from the woods. I tell my friend to turn around and we need to leave. I didn't tell her why because, like I said, I don't like to acknowledge these things until I'm far away from them. As soon as I heard her voice, I froze. She called out again. "Hello, little boy," she said. "Can you help me?" I turned to face her. She was behind me on the forest path, back the way I had just come. How could I not have seen her? Everything about her was pale. Pale white skin, pale blue eyes, and pale blonde hair. Her thin, graceful body was draped in a flowing and sheer, almost translucent white dress. Her eyes caught mine, and guided them down to her foot, which I now saw was wedged under a heavy log. "You look like a strong little boy," she said. "I bet you could lift this log up right over your head." She smiled. Her face eased into a mask of kindness, but beneath their shine her pale eyes flickered with a strange coldness. "I'm not supposed to talk to strangers," I said, taking a step back. The woman's smile broadened, but her eyes grew colder, like two blue chips of ice. "But you already talked to me," she said, "just now." "Well, yeah, but... And I'm sure your mother would never want you to refuse a lady in need," she continued. "Do you know what chivalry is, David?" Had I told her my name? I must have. "Uh-huh," I said. "It's like holding the door open for ladies." Her eyes sparkled. "Right you are," she said. "Chivalry is helping those in need, especially fair maidens. It's what knights do. Do you know what a knight is?" My face grew hot with anger. "Of course I know what a knight is," I said. "What kind of person doesn't know what a knight is? I sometimes forgot how stupid grown-ups could be." "Would you like to be a knight, David?" she asked. Her voice had grown hushed and smooth, like the rustle of silk sheets. I suddenly realized that the woman seemed to be growing, the world swaying. No, that wasn't right. I was walking. Why was I walking? I stopped. I seemed to be just out of her reach. For some reason I could not pinpoint. That fact seemed very important to me. "Why are you stopping, David?" the woman asked. Her pale blue eyes flickered for a moment, like a broken fluorescent light, and in that instant they were no longer blue, but solid black, like the eyes of a doll. My stomach dropped. I took a step back. "I really need to go home," I said. Her eyes flickered black again, and then her whole face. Beneath the milk-white skin was something like rough black leather. Thick yellow fluid oozed from cracks in her reptilian skin. Her black eyes were wide and crazed, and her mouth opened in a wide yawn to reveal 2 rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth. I could feel myself tilting forward, falling into her mouth. My face was blasted by the hot stink of her breath. It smelled like wet earth and rotting leaves. "Don't you want to be a knight?" a voice whispered inside my head. "Just one more step, and you can be my knight forever." My leg felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but I managed to lift my foot and take a step, backwards. The spell was instantly broken. I tumbled back to the forest floor, and when I looked up, the woman looked like a woman again, but she was no longer smiling. I was shaking as I pushed myself back to my feet. I felt exhausted, but I sprinted all the way home anyway, ignoring the calls of the woman that came from behind me. The next day at school, there was an assembly. The principal gave a speech while a serious-faced policeman stood next to him. One of the first graders, Sam Coogan, had disappeared on his way home. The principal urged anyone who knew anything to please come forward. No one spoke. That day, after school, I knew I had to walk the same path. Once my parents heard about Sam Coogan, I knew they would never let me walk home again, and I had to see for myself. I had to make sure. When the log was in sight, I stopped. There was something red poking up from the leaves beside it. Slowly, I walked closer. At first, I couldn't be sure what it was. It looked like maroon confetti. But when I was close enough to get a better look, I saw. It looked like an animal that the wolves had got to, except for one thing. In the middle of the puddle of red was a single child's shoe. I heard a rustle of leaves behind me, and I ran. I ran until my chest was on fire and my legs were rubber, and not once did I look back.